The Mekong Delta, South Vietnam, late November 1964. The night did not belong to the Americans. It belonged to the jungle, and it belonged to the men moving silently through the elephant grass. For the Viet Cong battalion commander Nguyen, the equation of war was simple. During the day, the sky belonged to the United States Air Force. Their silver jets, the F-100 Super Sabres and the F-4 Phantom, screamed overhead, dropping napalm and high-explosive ordnance. When the jets were in the air, Nguyen and his men vanished into the earth, hiding in tunnel networks that stretched for miles. But when the sun went down, the jets returned to their concrete sanctuaries in Da Nang and Bien Hoa. The American reliance on speed and technology was their greatest weakness. They could fly at Mach 1, but they could not see in the dark. Tonight was a standard operation. A remote outpost, defended by a terrified squad of South Vietnamese irregulars and perhaps 2 or 3 American advisors, sat exposed on a muddy rise near the river. Nguyen signaled his men. They had mortars, heavy machine guns, and the element of surprise. The plan was routine. Overwhelm the perimeter with a sudden barrage, breach the wire, eliminate the defenders, and vanish before the American reaction force could scramble their helicopters at dawn. The first mortar round whistled through the humid air, detonating against the sandbag walls of the outpost. The jungle erupted in muzzle flashes. The Viet Cong heavy machine guns began to chew through the defensive line. It was a massacre in motion. The South Vietnamese defenders were pinned down, screaming into their radios for support that was hours away. Nguyen watched with satisfaction. The enemy was blind. They were firing wildly into the black tree line, hitting nothing but wood and leaves. The victory was inevitable. Then, the sound changed. It was not the terrifying shriek of a jet engine engaging afterburners. It was not the rhythmic thwop 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 of a Huey helicopter. It was a low, groaning drone. It sounded tired. It sounded old. Nguyen looked up, squinting against the humidity. Above the heavy canopy, blocking out the stars, a shadow was circling. It was moving slowly, banking in a lazy, counterclockwise orbit. To the trained eye of a veteran soldier, the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a C-47 transport aircraft. Confusion rippled through the Viet Cong ranks. Why was an American cargo plane flying alone, at night, over a hot combat zone? These planes were relics from the Second World War. They were slow, lumbering trucks used to carry rice, ammunition, or mail. They had no armor, they had no bombs. They were defenseless targets. One of Nguyen's lieutenants laughed nervously. He gestured for the heavy machine gunner to aim upward. A slow-moving cargo plane at 2,000 feet was not a threat. It was a gift. It was a target practice. "Ignore the truck," Nguyen ordered, refocusing on the outpost. "Finish the soldiers." They advanced. They cut the wire. They were 50 meters from the bunker line. And then the sky tore open. There was no screech of a falling bomb. There was no whoosh of a rocket. There was a sound like a giant piece of canvas being ripped apart by the hands of a god. A deep, guttural brrrt that vibrated in the chest cavity of every man on the ground. From the black void where the cargo plane circled, a solid red beam of light connected the aircraft to the earth. It looked like a neon tube, glowing a fierce, angry crimson. It did not look like bullets. It looked like liquid fire being poured from a bucket. The beam touched the edge of the jungle where Nguyen's heavy weapons squad was positioned. In less than 3 seconds, the squad ceased to exist. The trees did not just break, they dissolved. The earth exploded into a cloud of red dust and splintered bone. The red beam swept sideways, like a flashlight searching the dark, but everything it touched was instantly obliterated. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out the mortars, the rifles, and the screams. "Take cover!" Nguyen screamed, diving into a crater. But there was no cover. The fire was coming from a steep angle, raining down with a density that defied physics. A standard machine gun fired perhaps 600 rounds per minute. This was firing thousands. The tracers were so close together they created an illusion of a solid line, a tongue of death licking the jungle floor. The harmless cargo plane banked again, continuing its slow, hypnotic circle. The red beam followed it, tracing a geometric circle of destruction around the outpost. The Viet Cong were trapped in a kill box. Panic, absolute and primal, took hold of the veteran guerrillas. They had fought the French. They had fought the Americans. They knew how to hide from bombs, but they did not know how to fight a dragon that breathed continuous fire from the night sky. Men dropped their weapons and ran, but you cannot outrun a bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second, fired from a platform that sees everything. The red beam swung again, hunting them. It felt personal. It felt intelligent. Nguyen crawled through the mud, his ears ringing, the smell of ozone and pulverized vegetation choking him. He looked up one last time at the lumbering shadow against the stars. It was just a cargo plane. It was impossible. A cargo plane cannot do this. As he retreated into the deep jungle, leaving his decimated battalion behind, the groaning engine droned on, indifferent, circling, waiting for anything else to move. Before we analyze how a World War II relic became the deadliest hunter of the Vietnam War, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact for more declassified military history. Hanoi, North Vietnam. 3 days later, the report lay on the desk of Senior Colonel Tran, a high-ranking intelligence officer within the People's Army of Vietnam. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of damp paper. Tran adjusted his spectacles and read the field report again. He had read it 4 times. It did not make sense. The report came from a surviving political officer in the Mekong region. It detailed a failed ambush. A battalion of seasoned fighters had been routed not by artillery, not by airstrikes, and not by ground reinforcements. They had been routed by a single aircraft. A cargo plane, Tran muttered, tracing the line on the paper. A C-47 aircraft. He looked at the junior analyst, standing nervously across the desk. You are telling me that the Americans have put a weapon inside a transport plane that can dissolve a square kilometer of jungle in 10 minutes? The survivors describe it as a dragon, Colonel, the analyst said quietly. They say it rained fire, solid streams of red light. They say the plane did not dive. It did not strafe. It simply circled and poured fire down like water. Tran stood up and walked to the map of the sector. He knew the American arsenal. He had studied the manuals on the F-105 Thunderchief, the A-1 Sky Raider, and the new helicopters. He knew their payloads. He knew their rate of fire. Standard machine guns overheated. Gun barrels melted if fired continuously. To create the solid red line described by the survivors, a weapon would need to fire at a rate that was mechanically impossible for a standard infantry gun. And the ammunition requirements. To fire that many rounds, Tran calculated aloud, an aircraft would need to carry thousands of pounds of ammunition. A fighter jet cannot do that. It runs out of bullets in seconds. He turned back to the analyst. But a cargo plane? A cargo plane is a flying truck. The realization hit him cold. The Americans were not using high-tech speed. They were using payload. They were turning the sky into an artillery platform. But the aiming? Tran questioned, probing the mystery. How do you aim guns out of a cargo plane? The guns point forward. The plane flies forward. If the plane is circling, the guns would be pointing away from the target. Unless, the analyst hesitated. Unless the guns are not pointing forward, Colonel. Unless they are pointing sideways. Tran stared at him. Sideways? That defied all aerodynamic combat logic. To shoot a target on the ground while flying sideways? The pilot would have to look out the side window? It was absurd. It was clumsy. It was something a child would invent. And yet, an entire Viet Cong battalion was gone. This is not just a modification, Tran said, his voice hardening. This is a new doctrine. They are turning the night against us. We need to know what is inside that plane. We need to know how it tracks us. And most importantly, we need to know how to kill it. He stamped the file. Priority 1. Find out what this dragon is, Tran ordered, before it eats the rest of our army. The mystery was not just about the gun. It was about the terrifying ingenuity of an enemy who could take a piece of junk from 1944 and turn it into the ultimate predator of 1964. The Americans had changed the rules of engagement, and Hanoi was playing catch-up. North Vietnamese intelligence headquarters, Hanoi, early 1965. The mystery of the dragon ship was no longer a rumor from the terrified survivors in the south. It was now a mathematical anomaly on the radar screens of the north. Senior Colonel Tran stood before a large acetate map. His analysts had plotted the flight paths of these new American attacks. The patterns were bizarre. Combat aircraft jets like the F-4 Phantom or dive bombers like the A-1 Sky Raider flew in straight lines. They dove, they released ordnance, and they pulled up. Their flight paths looked like jagged spikes on a chart. But these new attacks, they looked like coins dropped on a table. Perfect concentric circles. "Explain this geometry," Tran demanded. A young ballistics expert stepped forward, holding a wooden model of a C-47 aircraft. He tilted it onto its left wing. "It is a pylon turn, Colonel," the expert explained. "It is an old maneuver used by mail planes to drop sacks into a specific zone without landing, but the Americans have weaponized the mathematics." The expert moved the model in a circle around a red X on the map. If the pilot banks the aircraft at exactly 30 degrees and maintains a specific speed, the left side of the plane remains locked on a single point on the ground. It creates an inverted cone. The pilot does not need to aim. He simply looks out his side window. If he can see the target, he can hit the target. Tran stared at the model. It was brilliantly simple. In a jet, a pilot has perhaps 3 seconds to aim and fire before he passes the target. He has to circle back, which takes minutes. But in this pylon turn, the American pilot could keep his guns on the target for as long as he had fuel. He could fire continuously for 10, 20, 30 minutes. "It is a bucket of water," Tran murmured. "They are pouring bullets like water into a funnel." But there was a missing variable. A standard machine gun could not sustain that volume of fire. It would jam. It would melt. "We have recovered casings from a skirmish in the Central Highlands," the intelligence officer said, sliding a heavy metal box onto the table. He opened it. Inside were handfuls of brass shell casings. They were 7.62mm standard NATO rounds, but there were thousands of them recovered from a single acre. "Intelligence from our spies in Saigon suggests they are using a new weapon system," the officer continued. "They call it the minigun. It is not a gun in the traditional sense. It is an electric motor with 6 rotating barrels." Tran picked up a casing. The Americans had married the oldest plane in their inventory, a chassis designed in the 1930s with their newest, most experimental technology, the General Electric GAU-2, a minigun. The reports claimed each gun could fire 6,000 rounds per minute, and the aircraft carried 3 of them. Tran did the mental math. 18,000 rounds per minute, 300 bullets every second. The solid beam of light the survivors described was not an illusion. It was a statistical reality. They were putting a bullet into every square foot of the kill zone. This spooky, Tran used the American call sign they had intercepted, is not a combat aircraft, it is a suppression weapon. It is designed to break the will of the infantry. He looked at the map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vital artery supplying the war in the south. The trucks moved at night to avoid the jets. But this spooky, it hunted at night. It loitered. It watched. If it began patrolling the trail, the flow of supplies would stop. "We cannot hide from it," Tran concluded. "We must shoot it down." Laos-Vietnam border. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. 3 months later, the ambush was set. Battalion Commander Lay knew the Americans were becoming arrogant. The spooky gunships were flying lower and lower, sometimes orbiting at just 2,000 feet to get better accuracy. The pilots felt invincible. They believed the night protected them. They believed the Viet Cong only had small arms AK-47 rifles that were useless against a plane at that altitude. But tonight, La had a surprise. Hidden under the triple canopy jungle, camouflaged with fresh palm fronds, were 2 Soviet-made 37mm anti-aircraft guns. These were not rifles, these were cannons. They fired high-explosive shells that could tear a wing off a cargo plane with a single hit. They waited. The jungle breathed, hot and heavy. Then, the drone arrived. That distinctive, tired groan of the twin radial engines. It was hunting. Lay watched through his binoculars. He could see the black silhouette blotting out the stars. It was moving so slowly it looked like a toy. It began its bank, rolling into the pylon turn, preparing to rain fire on a suspected truck park a mile down the road. "Wait," he whispered to his gun crews. "Let him get comfortable. Let him think he is safe." The C-47 aircraft settled into its orbit. The sky erupted. The red tongue of the miniguns lashed out, chewing up the empty trucks Le had used as bait. The sound was a terrifying, continuous roar. "Brrrr!" "Now," Le screamed. "Open fire." The camouflage nets were thrown back. The 37mm cannons barked, sending glowing orange tracers racing up into the dark. The effect was immediate. The slow, lumbering cargo plane was not an F-4 Phantom. It could not hit afterburners, it could not pull 7Gs and roll away. It was a bus. The anti-aircraft shells walked right into the fuselage. Le saw the explosions sparkle along the wing route. He saw pieces of aluminum shower down like confetti. "Got him!" the gunner cheered. Smoke began to trail from the C-47's left engine. The red beam of the miniguns cut off instantly. The plane lurched, trying to level out, its engines sputtering and coughing. Le watched with grim satisfaction. The Dragon was bleeding. The Americans had made a fatal error. They had brought a slow, unarmored plane into a war zone filled with heavy weapons. They had traded speed for firepower, and now they were paying the price. But the plane did not fall. To Leigh's astonishment, the ancient aircraft absorbed the punishment. It was built like a tank. The fabric control surfaces were torn, the metal skin was riddled with holes, but the structural spars held. The pilot feathered the dying engine, applied full power to the remaining one, and began to limp away toward the safety of the cloud layer. It was escaping. "Fire again!" Le roared. "Bring it down!" But the 37mm guns had a slow rate of fire, and the plane was disappearing into the mist. As the sound of the engine faded, Le felt a cold dread replace his triumph. He had damaged one. He had proven they could be hit, but he had not killed it. And he knew something else. The Americans were engineers. They were problem solvers. If their Spooky was vulnerable to 37mm fire, they would not stop flying. They would simply build a bigger, harder, deadlier monster. The C-47 was just the experiment. The true horror was yet to come. Back in Hanoi, Colonel Tran read the report of the engagement. The C-47 had survived, but barely. The vulnerability was confirmed. "They will upgrade," Tran said to the silent room. "They will take this concept, and they will put it on a platform that can carry more guns, bigger guns. They will put computers on it." He looked at the intelligence photos of the new American transport planes arriving in theater. The C-130 Hercules. A massive, 4-engine beast. "If they put those guns on a Hercules," Tran whispered, "there will be nowhere left to hide." The mystery had shifted. It was no longer about what the weapon was. It was about how far the Americans would take it. The era of the AC-47 was ending, but the era of the gunship was just beginning. And the next iteration would not just rain bullets, it would rain artillery. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, southern Laos, late 1967. The war had evolved. It was no longer a conflict of skirmishes, it was an industrial war of logistics. And the North Vietnamese had learned. Battalion Commander Lê, now a seasoned veteran of the logistical corridor, watched his convoy of 20 ZIL-157 trucks rumble slowly through the limestone pass. They were driving blind, no headlights, no marker lights, not even a cigarette was allowed to be lit. They had adapted to the Spooky. The AC-47 was terrifying, yes, but it had a fatal flaw. It needed light. To aim its miniguns, the Spooky had to drop magnesium flares that turned the night into a flickering, ghostly day. When the flares popped, the truck drivers knew to stop and hide under the canopy. If there was no light, there was no shooting. The equation was that simple. The darkness was still their ally. As long as they stayed in the pitch black, the Americans were blind. Le sat in the lead jeep, listening to the jungle. The monsoon rain was falling, a heavy curtain that obscured the moon. It was perfect weather for moving supplies. No American pilot could see through this soup. Then, he heard it. It was a different sound. Not the coughing, rattling groan of the old 2-engine C-47. This was a high-pitched, turbine whine, a steady, powerful hum. "Thrum, thrum, thrum, thrum. 4 engines," the driver whispered, gripping the wheel. Lê looked up. He saw nothing. No stars. No silhouette. Just the crushing blackness of the storm. "Keep moving," Lê ordered. "They cannot see us without flares. If they drop a flare, we scatter." They waited for the pop of the magnesium parachute flare. They waited for the light. It never came. Instead, the jungle ahead of them simply disintegrated. There was no warning, no tracer stream leading the way. The lead truck, carrying 3 tons of ammunition, didn't just catch fire, it vaporized. A split second later, the sound of the impact reached them, a terrifying buzzing roar, like a giant canvas ripping, but deeper and faster than the miniguns. "Bruh, crump! Ambush!" someone screamed. Mines! But mines do not fall from the sky. Le jumped from the jeep. Get out! Into the trees! The second truck exploded. Then the third. The destruction was methodical. It was rhythmic. Something was walking down the line of the convoy, picking off the vehicles one by one. But there were still no flares. The sky was pitch black. The Americans were firing from the darkness, into the darkness, with pinpoint accuracy. How are they doing this? Le screamed over the roar of secondary explosions. They are shooting at ghosts! Then came a new sound. It wasn't the buzz of a rotary gun. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pumping. Thump, thump, thump. 30 meters away, a tree trunk as wide as a man exploded into splinters. These were not bullets. These were cannon shells, high explosive rounds. Le pressed his face into the mud. The Americans had put artillery in the sky. The carnage lasted for 20 minutes. When the 4-engine drone finally banked away, fading into the wet night, 18 of the 20 trucks were burning. The convoy was gone. Le stood up, shaking, covered in ash and rain. He looked at the burning wrecks. The enemy had changed the rules again. They didn't need light anymore. They had found a way to strip the North Vietnamese of their only protection, the dark. General Staff Headquarters, Hanoi. 2 weeks later, the mood in the briefing room was funereal. Senior Colonel Tran placed a jagged piece of shrapnel on the table. It was heavy, jagged steel, far larger than a bullet. 40mm, Tran stated. Bofors anti-aircraft shell, the kind we use to shoot at their planes. Now, they are shooting them at our trucks. He walked to the chalkboard. We have identified the new airframe. It is the Lockheed C-130 Hercules. They call it Spectre. The officers murmured. The Hercules was a massive lift transport. It could carry 4 times the payload of the old C-47. But the guns are not the problem, Tran said, his voice tight. We can fight guns. The problem is the eyes. He pulled down a projector screen. It showed a blurry, grainy photograph obtained from a Soviet intelligence liaison. It showed a pod mounted on the underside of the American aircraft. We believe, Tran said, tapping the image, that they have deployed a sensor previously used only on experimental satellites. It does not see light, it sees heat. The room went silent. Infrared, an older general asked, skeptical. Through the jungle canopy? Through the rain? The engines of our trucks, Tran explained, run at 80 degrees Celsius. The jungle floor is 25 degrees. To this machine, our convoy looks like a string of burning candles on a black table. They can see the heat of the exhaust. They can see the warmth of the tires. Tran paused, letting the horror sink in. They can see the body heat of a squad of men. The implications were catastrophic. The entire strategy of the People's Army relied on the cover of night and the cover of the jungle. If the Americans could see heat, there was no camouflage. A leaf protects you from a camera. It does not protect you from a thermal sensor. And there is more, Tran continued, flipping to the next page of the report. The accuracy. A pilot cannot aim a 40mm cannon while banking at 200 miles per hour in turbulence. It is humanly impossible. He gestured to the ballistics data. The hits on the convoy were centered, perfectly centered. They have connected the sensors to a computer, Tran said. We are not fighting men anymore. We are fighting an algorithm. The pilot circles. The sensor locks onto the heat signature. The computer calculates the wind, the speed, the angle, and the ballistics. The computer pulls the trigger. The officers stared at the table. They were fighting a war of peasant resilience against space-age automation. We call it the black spot, Tran said softly, because that is what our drivers see on the road before they die. A black shadow that sees everything. But Colonel Tran was a pragmatist. He knew that every machine had a weakness. The C-130 was bigger, deadlier, and smarter. But it was also heavier. They are arrogant, Tran said, his eyes narrowing. They are flying a 50-ton warehouse in tight circles over our heads. They rely on the darkness to hide them from our eyes, just as they use the sensors to pierce our darkness. He slammed his hand on the map. We must light them up. If they want to play in the dark, we will bring the sun to them. He turned to his aides. Move the 57mm radar-guided guns to the trail, and bring the SA-7 missiles. The Spectre thinks it is a hunter. We will turn it into the hunted. The twist had been revealed. The Americans had conquered the night with thermal vision and computers. The Viet Cong were being slaughtered by math and physics. But the escalation was about to reach its peak. The Americans had put cannons on a plane, but they were about to do something even crazier. They were about to turn a cargo plane into a flying tank destroyer. And the North Vietnamese were about to unleash their own surprise, a weapon that would force the American gunships to face the one thing they couldn't calculate: fear. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. The Easter Offensive, spring 1972. The war had changed face once again. The guerrilla skirmishes in the jungle were over. This was no longer a conflict of shadows and AK-47 rifles. This was a full-scale conventional invasion. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had poured across the DMZ with a force that rivaled the armies of World War II. And for the first time they brought the iron fist of the Soviet Union with them, main battle tanks. Major Vinh sat in the commander's cupola of his T-54 tank. He felt invincible. For years the Americans had owned the roads because the North Vietnamese lacked armor. But the T-54 was a beast. It had 100 millimeters of sloping frontal armor. It had a massive cannon. It was designed to fight NATO forces on the plains of Europe. Vinh looked at the column stretching behind him. Dozens of tanks, supported by armored personnel carriers and mobile anti-aircraft guns. They were rolling south on Highway 1, crushing everything in their path. Tonight the sky was overcast, low clouds at 4,000 feet. Vinh knew the American jets, the Phantoms and the Skyhawks would struggle to dive bomb in this weather. The low ceiling forced them into the range of the NVA's ZSU-234 Shilka anti-aircraft tanks. "Keep moving," Vinh ordered his driver. "We will be in Hue City by dawn." He heard the drone overhead. Vinh smirked. He checked his periscope. It was the Spectre, the AC-130 gunship. By 1972, every NVA officer knew what the Spectre was. They knew about the miniguns. They knew about the 40mm Bofors cannons. "Button up," Vinh ordered. The hatches slammed shut. Inside the steel belly of the T-54, the crew was calm. The Spectre was terrifying to infantry, and it could destroy soft-skinned trucks. But against a T-54 tank, it was a nuisance. The 20mm rounds would bounce off the turret like hail. Even the 40mm explosive shells would only scorch the paint or damage the optics. They could not penetrate the hull. The tank was a moving fortress. The gunship was a predator that had lost its teeth. Vinh watched through the armored vision block. He saw the red flashes of the 40mm rounds impacting the road around them. Thump, thump, thump. Explosions kicked up dirt and debris. A piece of shrapnel clanged uselessly against the turret. "Ignore him," Vinh laughed. "He is throwing stones at a rhino." The Spectre circled. It seemed frustrated. It was loitering, watching the column of unstoppable steel. Then, the world ended. There was no whine of a falling bomb. There was no stream of tracers. There was simply a blinding flash of white light, followed instantly by a sound that felt like the planet cracking in half. Crack, boom. Vinh's tank violently shuddered, the suspension groaning under a massive shockwave. "What was that?" the gunner screamed. "Artillery?" Vinh spun the periscope. The tank directly in front of him, Tiger III, was gone. It wasn't just disabled. It wasn't just burning. The 40-ton vehicle had been smashed open. The turret, weighing 9 tons, had been ripped off the chassis and thrown 20 meters into the rice paddy. The hull was a twisted, burning flower of metal. "Artillery!" Vinh shouted. "They have a battery zeroed on the road. Evasive action." But his mind raced. This was impossible. There were no American artillery bases within 20 miles. And artillery fired from miles away takes time to fly. It comes in a barrage. This was a single surgical hit. Crack, boom! Another explosion. This time, the T-54 behind him disintegrated. The shockwave was so powerful, it cracked Vinh's optics. This was not a mortar. This was not a 40mm grenade. This was a heavy siege shell, a high explosive impact that obliterated armor. "Where is it coming from?" the driver screamed, reversing blindly. Vinh looked up through the cracked prism. The only thing in the sky was the drone of the 4-engine cargo plane. "It can't be," Vinh whispered. The plane banked. A flash of light appeared on the side of the aircraft, not the flicker of a machine gun, but a massive muzzle flash, like a battleship firing a broadside. A split second later, the ground next to Vinh's tank erupted. The concussion wave knocked him unconscious against the turret wall. The last thing he thought before the darkness took him was a question that defied all logic. Since when do airplanes carry cannons? General Intelligence Department, Hanoi. 1 week later, Senior Colonel Tran sat in a room that was silent as a grave. The Easter offensive had stalled. The tank columns, the pride of the People's Army, were burning wrecks on the side of the highways. On the table before him lay a series of photographs taken by a reconnaissance team near Unlock. They showed the wreckage of T-54 tanks. The armor was not penetrated, the ballistics expert said, his voice trembling. It was crushed. The kinetic energy of the impact was sufficient to shear the turret ring bolts. The pressure wave inside the tank liquefied the crew. Tran looked at the report. What weapon does this? A 105mm howitzer, the expert said. Tran stared at him. A field gun? An artillery piece? You are telling me the Americans have an artillery battery floating in the clouds? Yes, Colonel. The expert opened a technical manual seized from a downed American pilot. It contained a diagram of the latest modification to the AC-130E. The Americans had done the insane. They had taken the M102 howitzer, a massive cannon usually towed by a truck and anchored to the ground with spades to handle the recoil, and they had mounted it inside the fuselage of an airplane. The physics, Tran muttered, tracing the diagram. The recoil alone should tear the airframe apart. When a 105mm gun fires, it kicks back with thousands of pounds of force. In the air, it should push the plane sideways. It should stall the wing. They built a recoil absorption system, the expert explained. A hydraulic buffer. And the computer. The computer compensates for the kick. It fires, the plane shudders, and the pilot corrects. Tran closed his eyes. He pictured the scene. A pilot flying a cargo plane at night, looking at a thermal screen, firing a cannon big enough to level a building with an accuracy that could hit a moving tank from 12,000 feet. The Dragon, AC-47, had been a machine gunner. The Spectre, AC-130A, had been a grenadier. But this Super Spectre, this was a flying battleship. They have achieved the ultimate high ground, Tran said quietly. They can bring siege artillery to any point on the map at 300 miles per hour. They do not need to set up a base. They do not need to calculate coordinates. They just circle and fire. The intelligence officer read the final casualty assessments. The troops are calling it the hand of God. One moment you are driving a tank, the next moment you are erased. There is no defense. The shells travel faster than sound. You die before you hear the gunfire. Tran realized the grim truth. The Americans had solved the problem of the tank not by building a better tank, but by rendering the concept of the tank obsolete. Why fight armor with armor when you can simply drop a 105mm shell on the roof, where the armor is thinnest? The mystery of the title "Rebel Forces Fled" was now fully explained. They didn't flee because of bravery or tactics. They fled because the jungle, which had been their sanctuary, had been turned into a shooting gallery by a weapon that defied the laws of traditional warfare. The AC-130 did not just bring guns to a fight. It brought an entire artillery battery, packed it into a crate, and flew it over the enemy's head. The legacy of the gunship. The introduction of the 105mm howitzer marked the pinnacle of the gunship concept. What started as a desperate experiment with a cargo plane and some welding torches in 1964 had evolved, in less than a decade, into the most complex and lethal close-air support weapon in history. For the soldiers on the ground, both American and Vietnamese, the sound of the AC-130 engines was the sound of judgment. For the Americans, it meant salvation. The Spooky and Spectre saved thousands of outposts from being overrun. For the enemy, it meant that the night was no longer safe. The darkness had eyes, and those eyes had cannons. Even decades later, military historians would look back at the AC-130 and marvel. In an age of supersonic jets and stealth bombers, the most feared aircraft in the sky was a slow, fat cargo plane that flew in circles, armed with the firepower of a destroyer.